Hello, everyone. Thank you all very much for joining us today at the BAI Global Forum. My name is Yuko Itatsu. I'm a professor at the University of Tokyo at the Interfaculty Initiative in Information Studies and the director of the BAI Global Forum. We're hosting our event today from the Institute for AI and Beyond at the University of Tokyo. We'd like to thank the director, Professor Hagiya, and his team for his generous and kind support in inviting our guests and hosting our event today. Today, we're delighted to be welcoming Dr. Richard Carter-White and Dr. Maartje Roelofsen to speak about the use of current visual reality devices and the extent of its efficacy in teaching and learning experiences. Dr. Richard Carter-White is a senior lecturer in human geography at the School of Social Science at Macquarie University. He works at the intersections of cultural and political geography and has published extensively on the geographies of trauma and representations of testimonies of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. Dr. Maartje Roelofsen is a postdoctoral researcher at the Faculty of Economics and Business at the Universitat Oberta de Catalunya in Spain. Previously, she was an associate lecturer at Macquarie University. Dr. Roelofsen's interests lie in how digital platforms and technologies affect and shape mobility, societal relations, social relations, intimate spaces, and people's senses of themselves. Her works include a monograph entitled Hospitality, Home and Life in the Platform Economies of Tourism, which came out earlier this year from Palgrave Macmillan. They have co-authored a paper titled Virtual Reality as a Spatial Prompt in Geography, Learning and Teaching, which was published in June this year in the journal Geographical Research. And the title, the paper is the basis for this lecture today. The title of the lecture today is Embodiment, Deferral and Disinhibition, Learning and Teaching Geography with Virtual Reality. Our guests will speak for about 50 minutes or so, and then we'll use the remaining time for Q&A. There'll be a 5-minute break in between. So without further ado, let's welcome our guest speakers, Maartje Roelofsen and Richard Carter-White.
Thank you very much. So we just need to share our screen. Okay. See if it works then. Perfect. Thank you so much, Professor Itatsu, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to the BAI Forum for inviting us so generously, and for everyone coming along to listen to us both in person and online. We really appreciate it. As Professor Itatsu said, this lecture is based on a paper that Maartje and I published earlier this year. But this paper was written during lockdown, and we were in 2 different continents, and we had no real chance to present this work to anybody yet. So it's a huge honor for us to present this work to you, and we're really looking forward to discussing it during the session. So thank you so much. So my background is in human geography, which in the British context I was trained in and the Australian context I now work in is a critical social science that aims to understand human cultures, societies, and economies with an emphasis on spatial relationships and processes. And my work sits somewhere between cultural and political geography. And over the past 15 years, a big part of my research has focused on the geographical aspects of the Holocaust, and in particular, the use of the concentration camp as a place used by the Nazi regime dedicated to several forms of violence. But as a geographer, I'm also very interested in places which aim to preserve the memory of violent events, sites of so-called difficult heritage, such as memorials and museums to wars, prisons, and atrocities. A few years ago, I wrote a book chapter examining the use of Instagram by people who have visited the Auschwitz State Museum. And this interest in the relationship between digital technology and difficult heritage is how I started to work with Maartje.
Well, thank you, Rich. I also would like to express my thanks to come here today and to present our research. I really, really appreciate it. So as mentioned, my name is Maartje Roelofsen. I'm a tourism scholar who, like Richard, has received training in human geography departments. And I'm now working as a postdoctoral researcher at the Universitat Oberta de Catalunya in Spain. My research interests lie at the intersection of cultural, digital, and tourism geographies, which broadly speaking merge into these three main themes, being digital transformations of tourism spaces and places, social and spatial inequalities in tourism and leisure, and more recently, geography, education, and digital pedagogy. And in terms of empirical work and application, these have branched out into three main projects. The first being short-term rental platform Airbnb, a digital platform, and its impact on various skills, being the city, the home, and also everyday life. But also within that project, I more specifically look at intersections of gender, class, and race in hospitality and tourism work. And more recently, I've been looking at virtual reality as a pedagogical tool in geography education. Now today, as Richard mentioned, we will be talking about this latest collaborative work on VR. And I'd like to say a few introductory words about what brought us to research this specific topic. So to provide some background, also on the current tendencies around the digitalization of education and the related developments of virtual field trips within geography. Now, the development of educational technology and the related critical study of educational technology has a very long history. And this history has been exemplified in specific fields of research and also specialized academic journals such as Learning, Media, and Technology. But today in this lecture, we discuss virtual reality technology as part of a broader set of digital technologies that have shaped education over the last few decades. Today's increased availability of VR in higher education across countries, but also within regions, can arguably be explained by policy-driven changes. So the promotion of digital literacy among citizens, and particularly among younger generations in society, is seen as really fundamental to bolster their employability, but also entrepreneurship. Increasingly, an increasing number of enrolled students in education has also led to the increased demand for distance learning and teaching, which today is mostly enabled exclusively through digital technology. And I believe that this trend, as some of you may know, has only become more and more pronounced through the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, which really saw an unprecedented acceleration in the uptake and development of digital tech to enable learning and teaching from a distance. So consequently, government funders have sought to promote understanding of emerging technologies such as VR and also their application in education. Now, within geography specifically, there are a number of virtual realities that are commonly used. There are many, many more, and these are just a few examples. Second Life, which is here shown in the background of the slide, is one of the earliest internet-based 3D technologies that facilitates teaching, communicating, and collaborating in an entirely online world. And in this world, teachers and students use their own avatars to represent themselves. But also in geography related degree programs like architecture and also in planning degrees, teachers and students have long relied heavily on virtual reality software, such as Esri's ArcGIS, to design 3D virtual models of buildings, but also environments. And more recently, students enrolled in geography teaching degree programs have also started to create their own VR content through 3D recording devices, mostly as part of developing digital didactic skills and geography curricula. But perhaps more commonly used and also related to our presentation today are VR applications that facilitate virtual reality field trips. A popular program or application is Google Expeditions, which allows students and teachers to experience 3D environments all around the world. Now, field trips are certainly not exclusive to geography degrees alone, but they're often essential components to undergraduate geography degrees. And they offer students and also teachers a very valuable experience and opportunity to apply very theoretical concepts or methodologies in a supposed real world, which offers obviously a different experience than those offered in the classroom or in tutorials. We believe that visiting sites remains key to students' education, but they can also bring forth a number of challenges. The distance or time, sometimes relatively high expenses and health and safety issues, and also accessibility issues are a few of the many constraints that we as educators and students are often dealing with, and that make it sometimes a little bit difficult to facilitate and take part in field trips and field work. So field trips that are enabled through virtual reality technology potentially enhance this accessibility and inclusivity aspect among students and teachers. Virtual reality arguably allows users of this technology to leave the limits of the body behind and to embark on these field trips free from many of the constraints that I just described. Richard and I first considered implementing such a virtual field trip when I was running the postgraduate course Heritage and its Management at Macquarie University in 2018 and 2019. So I was the convener of the course at that time. And within this course, we dedicated a full day workshop to the theme of difficult heritage, which focuses entirely on the practices and politics of memorialization in places that are associated with death, genocide, trauma, and other violent histories. Given Richard's expertise on the topic, he delivered a guest lecture on the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, ABSM for short, which is UNESCO World Heritage listed and located in Oświęcim in Poland. Just a few months before we started this guest lecture, Macquarie University had actually opened a virtual reality room in the library, the so-called room. This allowed students and teachers to use this VR technology freely for educational purposes or for leisure purposes. And Richard and I started to consider actually how could we apply this specific space, the room and its technology, to learning and teaching about heritage and specifically about the ABSM, which at the time was thousands of kilometers away from us, from the classroom.
Yeah, so just to tell the same story from my perspective a little bit, when I gave this guest lecture in Maartje's unit, I gave the students some basic historical knowledge about Auschwitz and its place within the history of Nazism. But I also wanted to give them a sense of what it's like in the modern museum, the Auschwitz Museum in Poland. And I visited that museum as a tourist in 2004, and then for 2 weeks as a PhD student in 2007. And the geography of this place is really quite interesting. When you visit this museum, it's possible to stay in the local area, but most people will travel from the nearby city of Krakow by train or by bus. And the museum is split between two sites. Auschwitz I, which was the original site of the camp, before the Nazi regime expanded it to include many other sub-camps. And this is where you see the infamous entrance gates and many other buildings. And then there's the much larger Auschwitz II Birkenau sites in the bottom right there. I won't go into detail now, but it's important to note that when you visit this museum, your movements as a visitor are guided by the layout of the site in quite subtle ways, and particular landmarks and buildings of interest which have exhibitions and other ways of drawing attention, are placed quite strategically. So it'll be a great place to bring students for a field trip, to get them to think about the process and practice of difficult heritage. But for such a small unit, not many students, from a place as far away as Australia, it was impossible, of course, impossible to go there physically. And then the other thing to mention is that when I first visited this place in 2004, it had a really big impact on me, not necessarily because of what I actually learned that day, but instead I was really struck by the strangeness of standing on the same ground where so many people had suffered in the past, and not really knowing why I was there or what the purpose of my visit had been. And that puzzle has stuck with me ever since, for 18 years now and counting. And I mention that because, to me, the act of actually going to the place where these awful events happened was essential to any meaning that museum had for me. So when Maartje suggested, raise the possibility of using the VR room to take students on a virtual field trip to this place, where they would somehow get a sense of the place without going there, this was very intriguing to me because it was a complete opposite of my experience. And so that was when we started thinking more broadly and more theoretically about the relationship between human geography and VR via the focus of the field trip that we were thinking about. So in our view, there is maybe a sort of circular relationship between VR platforms and geography. On the one hand, if VR is about somehow creating the illusion or feeling of being in a different place, this is a great opportunity for human geography, given its emphasis on fieldwork. But then in the other direction, if human geography is a social science that offers theories to help us understand the spatial dimensions of existence, including how we as humans perceive the world around us, this seems really relevant for understanding more about what VR actually is, and might offer a useful way of talking about this technology and the learning opportunities that it offers. So Maartje and I decided to design a really small scale pilot research project that would explore these themes through the focus of a virtual reality field trip. And we had 3 specific questions to guide us with this. One was, how might VR change the way geography is taught? 2, in the other direction, how might geographical concepts provide a different theoretical perspective for thinking critically about VR as an educational tool? And then thirdly, what practical lessons can we learn for geography education from experimenting with a VR field trip in a course like this on difficult heritage management? So to illustrate the second question in particular, I want to now briefly discuss some of the existing geographical work which influenced our approach to this project. Because to us, given our training as geographers, VR does seem to us like a very geographical technology. It's probably our inherent bias, but we kind of feel that way because it's about making you think and feel like you're in a different place. And of course, we are not the first geographers to research about VR, and there's some really interesting work in geography education looking at how this technology can be used in the classroom to provide visual simulations of different environments. And much of this, again, is related to the traditional role of international field trips in geography undergraduate degrees. And as Maartje mentioned, this research is often based on this kind of common idea that VR offers a kind of instant transportation into a completely different immaterial world, as if you can leave your body behind and occupy a different environment. This idea is really appealing to geography educators, given all of those barriers to travel that Maartje mentioned before. Now, it's important to note, of course, these scholars are not naive or excessively optimistic about how well VR can do this. All of these studies mention challenges and limitations, which include things like the additional time and training that teachers and lecturers would need to learn how to use this technology. And of course, the varied ability of students to access and use VR technology too. not all students have the same digital literacy. I'm sure that's familiar to anybody who's taught over Zoom in the last 2-3 years. So there are challenges for sure. But what we noticed is that when geographers raise doubts about using VR in the classroom, they often tend to be these more logistical or technical doubts, questions of efficacy. There are some really key exceptions which we do discuss in the paper, but there's often an assumption that VR can and will be an effective substitute for the traditional geography field trip. And now it's just a question of working out how to do it properly. But this goes back to my previous point that if geography is partly about thinking critically about how humans perceive and act in the world, there's a real opportunity here to think more theoretically about VR technology from a geographical perspective. Geographers spend all their time developing theories about space and place and showing that these are not simple or self-evident things, but are actually really complex and have many different meanings. So if there's now sufficient enthusiasm behind this technology where it's necessary to start really thinking about what is a virtual field trip, we would hope that geography has something conceptual to offer to that conversation. And so this is when we look to a different area of geographical research, which is the subfield of digital geographies. Over the past 2 decades, and also for quite some time before that in a different form, geographers have increasingly researched digital technology, often drawing on philosophy and other social sciences and humanities to do so. And one of the really, for me, really inspiring contributions of this work is how it's critiqued the entire notion of the virtual. If we think for a second more abstractly about those benefits of VR mentioned earlier, they're ultimately based on the presumption, the idea that certain forms of travel are difficult in the real or material world, but are now possible in a virtual way. It's the idea that the real and the virtual are two entirely different and distinct dimensions of existence. We leave one and we enter the other, and that's a virtual field trip. And this real virtual distinction is, however, an idea that digital geographers have for many years argued against, because they say there just isn't such a simple distinction between the two. And there's a couple of reasons we've found very helpful in guiding our thoughts here. One is that if we think of a digital platform like VR as offering some kind of unreal or immaterial experience, this implies that on the other side, there is a natural mode of existence, which is completely untouched and unaffected by the digital. Now, maybe this way of life exists somewhere, but I think for the most part, everyday life is completely intertwined with digital technology, whether in terms of all the way we use smartphones and the internet as an unthinking part of everyday life, all the role of software and data and code in creating smart cities and coordinating economies and all these things. So, and even a traditional geography field trip is completely dependent on Google Maps and all kinds of other digital technology. So it's a big simplification to imagine there's a real world that's unaffected by the digital. And so this way of thinking that could ever separate the real and the virtual is something that needs to be questioned. And then more briefly, the other big critique that geographers have raised is that this idea of VR as somehow disembodied, where you can leave your body behind to travel to an immaterial realm, is a major simplification, or in regular language is wrong. Since VR and all digital technologies are so thoroughly embodied, our bodies are completely involved when we use digital tech. There's nothing immaterial about it. And we'll talk much more about this later in today's lecture. But so what all this amounts to is that in our discipline of geography, there are two sets of research related to VR that we think need to talk to each other. On the one side are geography educators who are cautiously excited about using VR, but haven't always questioned the geographical assumptions behind this technology. And then there's a subfield of human geography that's developed a really interesting, provocative, conceptual vocabulary for thinking about the geography of VR and all the ways it's connected to the material world. So what we wanted to do in our project is bring these two sets of literature together and consider what geographical theories of space, technology, and embodiment mean for innovative pedagogical work that seeks to incorporate VR into geography education.
So as Richard mentioned earlier, the main objective of this study was to critically examine the potential that virtual reality holds for pedagogical application in geography education. And to achieve this objective, Richard and I used a qualitative approach and relied on several ethnographic methods to elicit the subjective experiences of the participants and their use with VR. Initially, in 2018, we had a cohort of 15 students who were given the option to either visit the site, the ABSM, using Google Earth virtual reality in the room, which is here pictured on the slide on the top right, or they could take a tour of the ABSM on their own computers through the official website of the museum. So there's a tour available there as well. And this last option is often referred to as low immersion virtual reality. So it requires users to look at 2D or 3D environments or objects or experience on their computer screens, which they can then navigate manually with a mouse or a keyboard or a game controller. Now, after this visit, we conducted a survey. So we invited the students to reflect on their experiences and to comment on the possibilities and also the limitations of VR in representing and experiencing a heritage site like the ABSM. And this study in 2018 formed the so-called base study of our later work. In 2019, in the next offering of the course, we decided to opt for an alternative VR application to apply to the heritage course. So we decided to choose the VR documentary Inside Auschwitz. This documentary was compatible with the so-called HTC Vive, which is also pictured in the slide down there below, which was made available to us in the VR room. Now, as you can see, the HTC Vive device is a head-mounted device. It covers the ears and the eyes to provide a multi-sensorial experience. And together with motion controllers that are held in the hand and they're connected to external sensors in the room, this device really responds to the user's interaction with the technology. And it also allows for what they call a high immersive experience as such. And in this particular study, 5 students participated and also agreed to being observed during their virtual reality field trip. And later, 4 of these 5 students agreed also to being interviewed and to reflect on their experience by Richard afterwards. Now, just a few words about Inside Auschwitz. This is a guided tour of roughly 10 minutes, and it's freely accessible on YouTube. In this text below, you can see that there is a mention of the YouTube link. This tour is based on individual engagement, so it does not allow for any interactions with other participants in the tour. And in those short 10 minutes, the tour quite literally and also linearly guides you through a set of 360 degrees recordings and also drone footage of the former camp grounds. And these include some of the remaining buildings of the ABSM, like the barracks and the gas chambers. The whole documentary is narrated by 3 Holocaust survivors, 3 women, who give their accounts of what it was like to be in the camps. They describe what it was like to live, to survive, but also to witness other people suffer and die in the camps. And during this narrated tour, the documentary users have some degree of autonomy, just some degree. They can look around in each scene by moving their heads with the head-mounted display in different directions. As an introduction, Richard delivered 2 lectures on the Holocaust and the Auschwitz-Birkenau camps. We did this to prepare the students for the voluntary documentary trip. They also included visual materials of the camps, this lecture, of different periods of time. Now, based on our observations during the virtual reality field trip, but also our analysis of the interviews, we have structured our findings according to 3 different themes, which are disinhibition, deferral, and embodiment, hence the title of our talk.
Yeah, so thanks very much, Maartje. So in terms of the results of this project, given its really small scale, we're certainly not trying to suggest that the results from our study would be true for all geography VR field trips, and certainly not for all possible educational uses of this technology. But we did notice some of the same themes keeping on appearing in the interviews that I did with the students, who were great, and it was so interesting talking to them and listening to them. And we hope that by reflecting on these themes in relation to some geography theory, we can offer some hopefully useful points for educators who are considering using VR in their classes. Now, the first set of reflections from our project is really inspired by the work of the terrific geographer James Ash, and in particular, his observations about the ways that technology affects the people who use it. I want to just talk about that work a bit, and then I'll circle back to our project. So Ash talks in really interesting ways about questioning what we really mean by technology. And one of the ideas we've found helpful from him is that technology can mean anything that extends our ability to act and do things, anything that creates new possibilities for action. So we might think of something as simple as a spade as a technology, because of how it extends our ability to dig holes. It's a seemingly simple thing, but it radically changes what we can do as humans. But what's really interesting is how when we use new technology, the human user is also changed by that experience. For example, to use a spade effectively, you need to change how you stand. You need to adapt your body. And after a while, that becomes natural. This is what Ash and other geographers, drawing from philosophy, refer to as a technological unconscious. As Ash puts it, you develop new ways of using your body, new habits, or in his language, new bodily orientations. And it isn't just about your body either, because interacting with technology also changes your perception of space and the world around us. So to continue this example of the spade, after you've used the spade a lot and you become really good at it, perhaps when you look at a field, whereas before you might have just seen a bare piece of land, now you might look at it as something that can be dug up, transformed, developed, and so on. However, as you continue to use a particular technology, you also start to find there are limits to what that technology can do. And there are some things that it can't do at all. Perhaps as you wander around happily digging holes with your new and amazing spade abilities, you find that at some point there's ground that you cannot dig with a spade, or you discover that the kind of holes you can dig are limited. And in some situations, you need to use a pickaxe or a more complicated technology or some other tool. And these limitations also inform how the technology affects you as a user. And so Ash goes on to explain how when you use technology, there is a key process of exploring both the possibilities and the limits of what it allows you to do. And both of these affect the body and the spatial perception of the user. So I'm sorry about talking for spades so much, but we were really inspired by this idea of technology as something that both enables and constrains the user, and also by the language that Ash uses to describe this. When he goes on to write about video games and how this technology shapes and influences the player, he talks about inhibitors and disinhibitors, parts of the game that stop the player from doing things, and parts of the game that release the player's potential and enable new kinds of action. Now, I don't think we're using these concepts exactly as Ash is, but this idea of a technology user being both inhibited and disinhibited, constrained and released, really helped to make sense of what our participants talked about as they reflected on their VR experiences. So returning to our project, one of the first major things that our students talked about was a feeling of inhibition, or put more plainly, annoyance and frustration at what they couldn't do in this VR field trip. As Maartje described, yes, students could look around in 360 degrees during the video, but this was the limit of their freedom. Otherwise, the view that they could see through the headset was stuck on rails and entirely linear, one-directional. And the really interesting thing here is it was precisely because the 360-degree view was really good, it was really immersive and successful at making participants feel like they were there. It was then all the more surprising and frustrating when they abruptly encountered the limits of that immersion. What they really wanted to do was stop and explore spaces and objects of interest. And this was something the VR field trip seemed to both promise, because the immersion was successful in some ways, but also withhold because of its limits. In other words, because it seemed realistic in a way, users quickly became annoyed that it wasn't more real, more immersive, more free. This was something that I maybe half expected, because I'd had a similar feeling of disappointment when I first tried the VR video in some ways. What was surprising, though, is that after expressing their annoyance at the inhibitors of the VR field trip, students would go on to praise other forms of freedom and convenience that the linearity of the video made possible. So in other words, they understood very clearly, and they liked, how this inhibiting structure made possible a range of disinhibitions. And the most unexpected of these for us was a certain kind of social freedom, as articulated by the student in the top right here. So sometimes when we are present in a place where it's difficult to know how to act in proper ways, you don't know how to act, so you don't know how you might offend some people. When you watch the VR video, though, in this way, whatever way you act, it doesn't really matter, because you have your freedom, whatever you think and however you act. Now, we really sympathized with this insight and were kind of blown away by it. When I first visited the museum in 2004, one of the things that I thought about a lot was how other people were acting in ways that I thought were maybe a bit disrespectful to the seriousness and sadness of this place. But at the same time, I was thinking, what right do I have to judge other people who are no doubt visiting for all kinds of reasons that I've got no idea about? So there was this process of agonizing about the proper way to act in this incredibly sensitive place. So absolutely, how freeing it would be not to worry about any of this, to stop where you want, look where you want, in complete spatial and moral isolation. And not only was this a more relaxed experience for the student, which is no small thing, she also said this allowed her to concentrate more on the educational contents of the museum without being distracted by the expectations of performing and showing emotion to other people. And we think that is a genuine and important benefit that speaks to how VR might offer greater accessibility. This then got us thinking about other kinds of freedom that students had mentioned. Apart from this social or moral freedom, some students connected the spatial limitations of the VR field trip with a kind of temporal freedom. It was because the video was completely linear that they were able to infinitely rewind, replay, revisit parts of the tour. Whereas in real life, again, it could be really awkward if you miss part of a guided tour and you ask somebody to go back 10 minutes and start again. You can't really do that. And relatedly, students also were very impressed by the convenience of being able to instantly travel to this site compared to the hours and days it would take to actually go to Poland. So overall, in this part, we found that students would start off frustrated by the spatial constraints of the VR field trip, but eventually they would come to accept this loss of movement because of the advantages it gave. Now, when we were reflecting on these observations, we were really ambivalent, unsure how to feel about it. In some ways, it's really good if students feel more relaxed and able to concentrate on the virtual tour of such a difficult and complicated place as Auschwitz. But there's also something a bit uncomfortable about the idea of a convenient field trip to the Auschwitz State Museum. We were thinking maybe something important is lost if visitors to this place, virtual or otherwise, are not in some way made to reflect on matters of social etiquette and proper behavior, since this can lead to really key questions about why you're visiting this site and what its purpose is, and other moral and ethical reflections. Certainly, that's something that stayed with me 18 years after I first visited the museum. And I just wonder if the gravity of those reflections is something that can ever be touched upon in a VR experience that doesn't actually involve walking the same ground as the people who lived and died there. The time aspect is also really crucial, we think. I can remember so clearly the bus journey between the city of Krakow and the museum, as well as the train journeys I took on other occasions, because these were key transitional periods of time that allowed me to sit and reflect and process all of these somewhat intangible and difficult thoughts I was having. And we're not sure that being beamed into the site in an instant way is necessarily appropriate for the kind of learning outcomes we would normally associate with difficult heritage. In short, we're not sure difficult heritage is something that can be rushed. So that's quite a long discussion of that first finding. The second one is quite a bit quicker, but also an interesting one, we think. So at this point, it's important perhaps to temper our expectations of VR. You cannot expect a short VR video to reproduce the experience of actually traveling to the museum. And really, none of our participants in our study had expected that VR would do this. That wasn't a framing for our study. However, it was noteworthy that the students did constantly discuss the strengths and weaknesses of VR in relation to some imagined future visits to the actual museum, in a way that I don't think you would find with other representations of the site, like a photograph or a regular video. We honestly did not prompt the students to talk in this way, but they seemed to find it difficult not to. For example, when we asked the students about how effective they thought the VR platform was for learning about the history of Auschwitz, they consistently talked about it in terms of VR's unique capacity to generate curiosity about the site and what it's really like. As one student put it, it feels very real, as if you are standing in that particular place, so that develops an interest. When studying it from books, it might be that people lose interest, but this is something that keeps on going and you pay attention to every detail of the place. So the immersive VR video was seen as being more compelling than more familiar forms of representation. But as we've already suggested, this feeling of reality was vulnerable to a quite shocking disappointment when users suddenly encountered the limitations of the medium. I've mentioned the frustration with movement already, but students also described other problems that broke the feeling of immersion, including the fragmented nature of the video. As described in a quotation I'll read now, it keeps jumping around from one place to the other like a jumbled puzzle. So there's a weird interplay of feeling really immersed in this illusion and then being suddenly taken out of it. And what this resulted in was making students very keen to visit the actual site, the complete opposite of what was intended here. That was the main takeaway, it seems. Students now really wanted to visit the museum because they'd experienced this strange preview that was both engaging and quite frustrating. So in trying to think what role VR might have in the classroom, we feel like VR can actually be much more anchored to material sites than other representations, both in the sense of being connected to it, but also weighed down. In our case, it deferred attention outside itself to something better, which is hinted at in the VR experience, but can't be fully delivered. In the paper, we talk more about this idea of deferral and how the VR video was ultimately very dependent on first providing students with historical knowledge about Auschwitz, which could help them make sense of this kind of strange, fragmentary, and quite disruptive experience. Some of the students commented on this directly. They felt they had learned something about the camp's history from the VR experience, but it was really more of an illustration of the knowledge they had already brought to it from my lecture and their own studies. So this raises questions about how well VR can stand alone as a source of knowledge. But of course, that depends on many, many factors, including the subject in question and the design of the VR experience. But now I've talked too much, so I want to hand over to Maartje to what I think are the most interesting findings of this project, which are related to embodiment.
Okay. So as Richard mentioned earlier in his theoretical discussion, within the geography literature, the idea that VR offers a disembodied experience, that it kind of teleports you into a separate space, is not only considered a misrepresentation, but also a simplification. So virtual reality technology really requires bodily engagement. And at the same time, the technology also constantly acts upon and affects bodies to various degrees. And various examples of this very deeply embodied nature of VR emerge from the interviews with our participants. Firstly, the participants in our study experienced vertigo, a fear of falling, a loss of balance, and also other sensations that really alluded to this embodied and effectual responses that we consider no less real than you would have experienced in a material site. And this was, of course, also provoked by the design of the tour. It was really guided, and the drone camera that was used to record the tour also provoked these effects, because it meant that participants were variously flying above the former camp, above the barracks, and also hovering above the ground while they entered the famous the entry gate here, as you can see. In fact, to be more comfortable and to effectively move along with the guided tour, the participants really learned very quickly to adapt their bodies. They mentioned that they had to learn right there and then what it was that their bodies were capable of in doing in that space. And this brings us to the third point, which was that embodiment was one of the main conditions for learning about the ABSM through virtual reality, which in turn also depended on already existing bodily capacities and incapacities. So if and how participants could evoke these capacities while they were standing there and then in the room really started to reveal to us the embodied inequalities that are often embedded in digital technologies. The visual effects that were incorporated by the documentary makers really provoked a set of physiological responses, and they varied along with the movements of the participants' bodies. Similarly, virtual reality seems also to have a very specific physicality in mind, and that became very apparent to us through Catherine, one of our participants, who was struggling with the sheer size and the weight of the headset. So she mentions the headset is too heavy, so I have to hold it. The size is too big, the device is so heavy. And to cope with bodily discomfort, participants thus developed their own strategies, primarily to regain an internal sense of movement and position. Finally, the participants brought to our attention the matter of skill, a real geographical concept. So whilst relating or trying to relate to the spaces that participants were moving through, they mentioned they encountered difficulties in understanding the size, but also the depth of those spaces and the objects within those spaces in relation to themselves. So while trying to establish a scalar relationships, the participants started to look around for indicators that would enable some kind of comparison and measure in relation to their own bodies. which included, as you can see, the bedposts, but also potholes and birds that featured in this guided tour. So this made us really think about the role of the body in learning and how different bodies have different needs that enables consequently learning. And this also in turn really problematized in our idea this real and virtual distinction or dichotomy, and echoes in many instances also a long-standing feminist critique of science's equation of this disembodied view from nowhere with objectivity, which is also mentioned in the literature on digitality embodiment. In fact, our participants really mentioned they needed a grounded position to understand where they were. And this brings us to a set of conclusions.
Yeah, thanks, Maartje. So just thanks for listening along to us, everyone. I'm going to conclude quite briefly and really relate back to the research questions we asked at the beginning about the implications of VR for geography, but also how geographical concepts can offer a perspective on VR. So out of all these findings, the one that really stuck out to us is what the students were saying about social and moral freedom, the convenience of not having to worry about what other people think about them at a site of such sensitivity. We shouldn't have been surprised by this, because part of the enthusiasm behind VR in higher education is how it can remove logistical barriers to visiting distant places. But we were surprised. We hadn't expected this at all. And as I mentioned, we are a bit ambivalent about this idea and whether VR can find a way to create that moral gravity. But a more general concluding point we want to make is that basically VR still remains really unpredictable and open-ended. Our pilot study was really small and specific, and a different VR field trip might produce an entirely different set of reactions from students, a whole different technological unconscious. So the unpredictability of VR and the still unknown and unfolding nature of its impact on users means that it can't simply act as a straightforward replacement for traditional field trips. But actually, we think this is a good thing. If we put aside that idea of VR as a replacement for physically going to a place, it allows us to instead focus on all the new things that VR does offer, which in this case leads us to the essential strangeness of this VR field trip. That was powerfully evoked, I thought, by the student who was struggling to figure out the scale of objects and buildings in the VR field trip. That might seem like a negative, a flaw, but actually we think this could be quite productive. As educators, we often worry about how to help our students become more active learners. This is the entire philosophy of teaching that I learned about while working at ComOver. And here is a case of a student who suddenly became very active, scanning the environment, making comparisons, analyzing the landscape, trying to figure out what was going on, how this space works and was organized, and so on. Yes, her immersion was broken, but if we relinquish the aim of replacing traditional field trips, that's okay, break the immersion. Something else was happening. The student was really paying attention to the organization and management of this space, precisely because the technology wasn't quite working perfectly, and her immersion was being troubled. It was a really small moment. I don't want to overinflate this, but we wonder if there's something important here. VR starts to appear less like its own smooth and self-contained world, and more like a very interesting in-between space, just real enough to grab the students' attention and immerse them in a new environment, but also with the potential constantly to freeze and shatter this immersion and make the student question and challenge the world being presented to them, which is the very definition of critical thinking. So we've talked a lot about what could be considered flaws of VR in our project. Its reliance on prior knowledge, its deferral to a more satisfying future visit, but there's a positive reading to all of this. The most interesting conversations we had about the geography and management of the museum were provoked by occasions when the illusion of VR had been broken and something unexpected and unintended happened. In other words, the VR field trip had acted as a kind of spatial prompt, which had shaken students out of their passive and perhaps complacent viewing of the museum space and pushed them into an actively questioning mindset. This is something that's at the heart of geography education, but it's really hard to do, painfully hard. You can spend years trying to get students to see that ideas of space, place, scale, and so on are not natural and given, but are socially constructed. And yet the VR experience, in all its strangeness, achieved this quite accidentally in a few minutes. So our tentative conclusion is that perhaps let's feel free to do away with the idea of VR as a replacement for physical field trips, and instead think about how VR can function alongside traditional field trips, lectures, books, and all the other tools of geography pedagogy to engage students. And based on our experience, that will often be done not just through the success of immersion in another world, but also through its failure and the active questioning students that the interplay between those two will help produce. If I may, that's the end of the talk. I just wanted to talk very quickly about a couple of new projects that we are doing in relation to this research. It's just a couple more minutes. Thank you. So we hope this has been interesting and useful. And hopefully has shown that geography can offer things of interest to all the amazing work being done in the BAI forum. Just wanted to flag a couple of new projects we started working on. One of these on the left is the embodied politics of VR field trips in geography learning and teaching, which continues the themes from this project we just described, but really focuses on those questions of embodiment and access and inequality. And we're hoping to recruit a much larger number of undergraduate students to go on virtual field trips to a range of difficult heritage sites around the world. And then the second is in a much even more early stage, but it's inspired by some fascinating museum work that's currently happening around the world using digital technology to record, preserve, and circulate the testimony of and memory of survivors of the Holocaust and other genocides. This, I think, is really extraordinary, but we're especially interested in the recent use of AI to turn video recordings of survivors into interactive conversations where visitors can ask questions to digital witnesses and they will respond in real time. This is a fascinating development and a very different way of approaching traumatic memory in museum spaces as something that can be shared through a digital dialogue. So these are really early stage projects, but we are keen to talk to people with interests that's related to ours, but also very, very different to ours too. So if anybody would like to talk to us about anything we've discussed today, you can find us right here. So thank you very much.